What would you do if, in the middle of a simple checkpoint stop, your life changed forever just by looking into the eyes of someone you never imagined? Before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end, because what happened to this lonely truck driver with a national police officer seems straight out of a movie. But it happened in the middle of the desert. The engine roared like a tired heart, keeping Ernesto Dominguez awake after more than 13 straight hours at the wheel. His trailer, a wine-colored monster with silver stripes, rolled slowly along the hot road connecting Guadalajara with the border. The cargo was nothing more than appliances, washing machines and refrigerators to deliver in Nogales, but for Ernesto that trip was much more than work, it was an escape. Since his divorce, 4 years ago, the road had become both his refuge and his sentence. The horizon burned under the Sonoran sun, and the air conditioning barely kept the cabin breathable. Ernesto, with an unkempt beard and eyes marked by nights of solitude, murmured old songs to keep from falling asleep. The routine was always the same: drive, deliver, collect, reload. No one waited for him at home. No one called to ask if he was okay. Silence was his only companion. But that September afternoon, everything changed. The white blur of a checkpoint appeared in the distance, with low booths, flags barely waving in the breeze, and a line of trucks stopped for inspection. Ernesto sighed. He knew the procedure by heart. He pulled his documents from the glove box, ran a hand through his graying hair, and slowed until the trailer stopped in front of the orange cones. The sudden silence of the engine wrapped him in a strange void. As he stretched his sore shoulders, he noticed the figure approaching his window on foot. It wasn't just any officer. It was a woman. Her navy blue uniform stood out under the relentless sun, and her stride conveyed confidence, firmness, but also a calm that was hard to explain. Ernesto's heart, used to the monotonous beat of routine, began to pound with force. The officer removed her dark glasses, and then it happened. Her eyes, deep and serene, met Ernesto's, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. "Good afternoon, driver," she said with a clear, firm voice, yet full of unexpected humanity. "I am Officer Camila Rivas. I need to check your documents." He tried to respond normally, but his voice came out hoarse, broken. "Yes, of course. Here you go." As he handed her the folder, their fingers brushed for just an instant. It was enough for a shiver to run through Ernesto from his nape to his hands. Camila showed no reaction, calmly checking each paper, but Ernesto was paralyzed. He couldn't understand why, after so many years of isolation, something so small had shaken him so deeply. She read aloud softly. Ernesto Dominguez, origin, Guadalajara. Destination, Nogales, officer. While she noted the details in her notebook, Ernesto couldn't take his eyes off the way she furrowed her brow in concentration, or the slight gesture of her lips when she bit them as she thought. Small details that, without knowing why, captivated him as if they were signs meant for him. When she returned the documents, she looked him straight in the eyes. "Everything is in order. But you've been driving for too many hours, don't you think?" The question caught him by surprise. Normally, officers just checked and let him go. But she seemed truly concerned. 14 hours, more or less, he admitted with a tired smile. "But I'm used to it." "The road doesn't forgive, Mr. Dominguez," Camila replied with a tone that blended professionalism and tenderness. "You should rest before continuing." Ernesto nodded, but inside something was disarming him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had genuinely cared about him. When the officer stepped back, as if ready to say goodbye, Ernesto felt an impulse he couldn't stop. "Officer, have you been at this post for long?" She looked at him with slight surprise, then gave him the first smile he had seen from her. 2 years. And believe me, here you meet very interesting people." That comment, so simple, lingered in Ernesto's mind even after she walked toward another truck. He started the engine, moved forward following the signals, but before losing sight of her, Camila turned her head again. Their eyes met one last time, and the small smile she gave him stayed with him for the next few miles. Ernesto drove again through the desert, but no longer felt the same weight of loneliness. Something had changed. Maybe it was madness, but a spark had been lit inside him. What would you be willing to do to see again someone who has just awakened a feeling you thought was dead? Stay until the end and subscribe, because this story will surprise you with a twist you never imagined. The trailer rolled on for miles and miles under the desert moon, but Ernesto no longer felt the same exhaustion as before. His mind kept returning to the image of Officer Camila, the way she had pronounced his last name, the intensity of her dark brown eyes, the faint smile that had left him breathless. It was absurd, he kept telling himself. She was just doing her job. And he was just another truck driver among hundreds that passed through that checkpoint every day. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, the reality was different. Something had changed inside him. He delivered the cargo in Nogales at dawn, signed the papers with an indifferent client, and set off with the empty truck heading south. The routine was intact, but inside everything felt different. The hours at the wheel, once a refuge from the memories of his divorce, were now a torment. Camila appeared in every reflection of the rearview mirror, in every pause of silence in the cabin, in every fleeting thought before he blinked. He returned to his small apartment in Tlaquepaque at dawn. The place greeted him with its usual coldness: a single bed, a table with dirty dishes, an old television turned on only out of habit. Before, that emptiness didn't weigh on him. It was simply his life. But now, with Camila's memory still fresh, that apartment felt unbearably lonely. He slept only a few hours. When he woke up, the decision was made. He dialed the number of his usual contact at the transport company. "Don Umberto, it's Ernesto. Tell me you've got another load going north, anything at all." The man laughed in disbelief. "What's wrong with you, boy? You just got back from Nogales. You always rest at least 2 days before heading out again." "I need work, Don Umberto. Whatever you've got, even if it's heavy, even if it pays little." There was silence on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Let me check. Look, there's a shipment of machinery for Hermosillo. Leaves tomorrow morning from Zapopan. Are you interested?" "Of course," Ernesto replied too quickly. He hung up with a mix of nerves and euphoria. His heart was pounding as if it were his first date. And in a way, it was. He spent the night awake, imagining excuses to talk to Camila again. Should he act surprised to see her? Or admit he'd found a pretext to return? What if she didn't even remember him? The next morning, he loaded the machinery more carefully than usual, double-checked the tire pressure and oil level, and even changed into a shirt he had saved for special occasions. As he drove toward Sonora, he rehearsed possible conversations, lines he had never thought of saying to anyone. The desert seemed endless. The heat beat mercilessly against the windshield, but Ernesto wasn't thinking of fatigue or the road. Only of Camila's image in that impeccable uniform. And then, when the white booths of the checkpoint appeared in the distance, his heart began to pound so hard he felt his hands tremble on the wheel. He slowed and scanned the officers with his eyes. For a moment, he feared the worst. What if she wasn't on shift that day? What if she'd been transferred? But there she was. Camila was directing traffic in the left lane, standing tall and professional. When her eyes met Ernesto's through the windshield, something in her expression shifted. A slight surprise, perhaps even joy. She signaled him to pull aside with a firm gesture and walked up to the window. "Good morning, Mr. Dominguez," she said, and the fact that she remembered his name completely disarmed him. "Good morning, Officer Rivas. I got another load going north." "Business is good," he tried to sound casual, though his voice trembled slightly. She smiled, this time without hiding it behind her professional mask. "I'm glad to hear that. Your documents, please." Their fingers brushed again as he handed her the folder, and this time neither pulled away too quickly. It was an insignificant detail to anyone watching, but for Ernesto it was confirmation that he hadn't imagined that connection. Camila checked the papers and asked about the cargo, but her eyes didn't stay on the notebook, they were fixed on his. "Do you always transport such varied things?" she asked. "Depends on what they need. I've hauled everything from furniture to construction materials." "You must know many places." "Some, yes, though I almost never have time to enjoy them." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "That must be lonely." The same word she'd used days earlier. Ernesto nodded honestly. "It is. Until recently. Before he could add anything else, another officer interrupted. Rivas, we need you to check this truck. The magic broke. Camila returned his documents with a look of restrained frustration. Everything's in order, you can go. Ernesto nodded, resigned. But just as he was about to start the engine, she leaned a little closer to the window and whispered quickly. Do you know the restaurant El Refugio, at kilometer 182? Yes, of course. My shift ends at 8. Ernesto's heart skipped a beat. I'll be there. Camila smiled brightly, genuinely, and walked away as if nothing had happened. The rest of the trip to Hermosillo became an unbearable weight. Ernesto unloaded the machinery in a rush, turned down the client's dinner invitation, and headed straight back toward kilometer 182. The clock seemed to move slower than ever. El Refugio restaurant was a simple yellow-walled building, with a gravel parking lot lined with trucks. Colored lights hung outside, and the smell of grilled meat floated in the night air. Ernesto arrived half an hour early, too nervous to eat, too anxious to stay in his cab. He ordered a coffee and sat near the window. He checked the clock every 2 minutes until, at 8:20, a small car pulled into the lot. When Camila stepped out of the vehicle, she was no longer in uniform. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, but to Ernesto she looked more dazzling than ever. As she entered the restaurant, she saw him and gave him a smile that lit up the whole place. I thought you wouldn't come, she said, sitting across from him. I thought the same about you, Ernesto replied, trying to steady the tremor in his voice. And so began the first of many nights that would change their destiny. What would happen if a love born in secret between a truck driver and a national police officer became a risk capable of ruining everything? Stay until the end and subscribe, because what is about to happen will test not only their love but their very lives. The murmur of the restaurant faded for Ernesto as soon as Camila sat across from him. For the first time in years, a meal wasn't just fuel to keep driving. It was a moment he wanted to treasure. They ordered grilled meat, freshly made tortillas, and, to share, a flan for dessert. The conversation flowed naturally, though both knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. Camila told him she had studied criminology in Hermosillo before joining the national police. She spoke of her parents, who had a small ranch on the outskirts of the city, and of her younger sister who was about to graduate from medical school. As she spoke, her eyes shone with pride. Ernesto, for his part, shared stories from the road. The sunrises seen from the cab, the towns where he stopped for just a few minutes, the fellow truckers who became road brothers. He spoke of his trailer as if it were an old friend that had accompanied him through every defeat and every attempt to move forward. There was laughter, comfortable silences, and glances that said more than words ever could. When dessert arrived, Camila asked softly, "Don't you ever get tired of being alone?" Ernesto thought he would answer with the usual automatic phrase, but the words came out differently. I thought I didn't. I thought loneliness was easier, less painful than risking feeling something. But lately, he paused, aware that he was about to bare his soul. Lately I realize maybe I was just hiding. Camila lowered her gaze and smiled sadly. I hide too sometimes. In work, in routine. It's easier than taking the risk. Their eyes met across the table, and the world shrank to just the two of them. Ernesto knew in that instant there was no turning back. What he felt wasn't fleeting, it was real. When they left the restaurant, it was already past midnight. The gravel parking lot was lit only by a few yellow lights. They walked slowly toward their vehicles, neither wanting to say goodbye. By the cab of the trailer, Camila stopped. This is complicated, she said with a sigh. I know. Your job, my life on the road, Ernesto replied. It's not just that, she countered, stepping closer. It's that it's been so long since I've felt something like this. He swallowed hard, aware of the electric tension between them. Me too. Silence grew heavy, charged with possibilities. Finally, Camila leaned in and gave him a soft kiss on the cheek. Drive carefully, Ernesto. I always do, he answered with a clumsy smile. I pass through that post every day, she added in a low voice. Maybe I'll see you more often. Ernesto laughed softly. Maybe I'll find more loads going north. She smiled and walked to her car, throwing him one last look before disappearing into the night road. Ernesto climbed into his trailer, but he couldn't start it. He sat in silence for a moment, his cheeks still warm from the kiss, knowing something irreversible had begun. From that day on, everything changed. Their encounters became a secret dance. Ernesto invented excuses to take routes toward Sonora, even when it meant turning down more convenient loads. Camila, for her part, maintained her professionalism at the checkpoint, but they had created a silent code. A faint smile meant they could meet that night. A discreet wink meant the shift had been hard and she needed to talk. Sometimes, among Ernesto's documents, there would be a folded slip of paper with instructions about where and when to meet. They met in roadside restaurants, in hidden lookouts under the stars, in the cab of the trailer where hours passed like minutes. There they shared secrets, dreams, and fears they had never told anyone else. One night, while sitting on the hood of Camila's car watching the desert bathed in moonlight, Ernesto confessed what hurt him most. "My ex-wife left me 4 years ago. She said I was more in love with the road than with her. And maybe she was right. But now I feel like the road brought me to you." Camila held his hand tightly, and in that gesture, Ernesto knew he was already lost. He was hopelessly in love with her. But deep inside he also knew something else. Secrets never stay hidden for long. What would you do if you discovered that the forbidden love you just found could cost you your freedom, your job, or even your life? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what's coming will test every decision Ernesto and Camila make. The secret romance of Ernesto and Camila became the heartbeat of their days. For weeks, each encounter felt like a small miracle. A quick dinner in a roadside restaurant, a conversation in the trailer cab with the radio off, a walk under a star-filled sky where they allowed themselves to dream of a future they knew was almost impossible. But that happiness was too fragile to last. One October night, Camila arrived late to their meeting point. Ernesto, sitting on the hood of his truck parked at a lonely lookout, felt a chill the moment he saw the light of her car approaching. She got out in a hurry, her face tense, her eyes shining not with joy but with worry. "What's wrong?" Ernesto asked instantly, taking her hands. He noticed they were trembling. Camila took a deep breath before speaking. "We need to talk." Those 4 words were enough to make Ernesto's heart sink. "My supervisor has been asking questions," she confessed, avoiding his gaze. "About why some truckers pass through this post so often, about why certain inspections take longer than usual." "Ernesto, it won't take long before they notice it's always you." He felt a knot in his stomach. Does he suspect something? "I don't know. But I'm afraid he does." Camila finally looked him in the eyes, and Ernesto saw a deep pain in them. "And that's not all. A few days ago we intercepted information about a smuggling network that uses this route. Drugs, weapons, even human trafficking. And they believe some truckers are part of the network." Silence fell on them like a heavy blow. Ernesto understood what she didn't dare say. "They think I—" Camila shook her head firmly, squeezing his hand. "No, I know you're not. But if others start suspecting that we're close, they'll think I'm protecting you. They could accuse both of us." The desert around them felt more hostile than ever. The night wind blew with a strange chill, as if even nature knew what they shared was in danger. "So, what are you telling me?" Ernesto asked in a broken voice. "That we have to stop, at least for a while. Until the investigation ends, until things calm down." Ernesto's heart stopped for a second. "And what if it never ends? What if they transfer you far away?" Camila lowered her head, fighting back tears. "I don't know, Ernesto. I just know I can't risk my career, or your life." They sat in silence, on that same rock where they had so often laughed, now turned into the witness of a possible goodbye. That night, when Camila left without even giving him a kiss, Ernesto knew what they had built was hanging by a thread. The following days were unbearable. Ernesto kept working, but he avoided passing through the checkpoint. He took alternate routes, adding unnecessary hours to his trips just to not see her and make things worse. Yet every kilometer without her was torture. He slept little, and when he did, He dreamed of her eyes, her smile, the voice that had made him feel alive again. And he always woke with the same question drilled into his mind. What would you do if the only love you found in years also became the greatest danger of your life? Stay until the end and subscribe, because the decision Ernesto will make will drag him to a point of no return. The weeks without seeing Camila were hell. Ernesto took longer and longer routes, as if distance could calm the anxiety consuming his chest. He traveled as far as Mérida, crossed to Tijuana, hauled construction materials to Veracruz. But nothing worked. In every rearview mirror he saw Camila's eyes. In every rest stop he heard her voice telling him to take care. The truck, which had always been his refuge, became a rolling prison. The purr of the engine no longer brought him peace. It was a constant reminder of what he had lost. And then, on a random Tuesday, his phone rang. It was Don Umberto, his contact at the transport company. But this time, the voice on the other end sounded different. Tense. Ernesto, you have to come back to Guadalajara now. But I'm only halfway to Cancun, he protested, confused. Forget that delivery. You don't understand. The Federals came asking about you. Ernesto felt a chill run down his back. About me? What do they want? I don't know exactly, Umberto said gravely. But they mentioned an investigation in Sonora. Ernesto, what the hell are you involved in? The trucker swallowed hard, his throat dry. In nothing. I just do my job. Well, they don't see it that way. They said if you don't show up at the station within 48 hours, they'll issue a warrant. The call ended with Ernesto's hands trembling on the wheel. His first thought was to call Camila. But he quickly realized how absurd that impulse was. If they were investigating him, they were probably watching her too. And any direct contact could sink them both. He abandoned the load in Cancun with a false excuse and drove back to Guadalajara in a 20-hour trip without stopping. Paranoia consumed him. Every patrol car that passed seemed like a threat, every van parked on the roadside, a possible ambush. When he arrived at the company offices, Don Umberto was waiting with a grim expression. The Federals checked all your travel records. They were very interested in your trips to Sonora. They asked why you've taken so many loads on that route lately. Ernesto lowered his gaze. Of course they had noticed. He had made up excuses to pass through that checkpoint more often than usual. His pattern, which once seemed harmless, now looked suspicious. You have to go to the station, Umberto warned. If you don't, the only thing you'll accomplish is making it worse. That afternoon, Ernesto showed up at the federal headquarters. The gray concrete building, with dark windows, looked more threatening than any storm on the road. They took him to a cold room, with a metal table and 2 chairs. 2 men were waiting for him there. The first, gray-haired and weary-eyed, introduced himself as Agent Ramirez. The second, younger but equally severe, was Agent Torres. Mr. Dominguez, Ramirez began in a deep voice, we've noticed that in recent months you've traveled with unusual frequency toward Sonora. Can you explain the reason? Ernesto took a deep breath. I've just had luck with loads. Nothing more. Do you personally know any officer at the checkpoints along that route? Torres asked, drilling his eyes into him. Ernesto's heartbeat quickened, but he kept his face calm. No. I only see them when they ask for my documents. Like everyone else. You've never had extended conversations with any of them? Ramirez pressed. Only what's necessary for the inspection. Nothing more. The interrogation dragged on for hours. The same questions repeated 1,000 different ways. Ernesto answered calmly, hiding the storm inside. But every time they mentioned the checkpoint officers, he feared they would speak Camila's name at any moment. Finally, they let him go with a warning. He was not to leave the city without notifying them. That night, in his empty apartment, Ernesto understood the true weight of the situation. It was no longer just about an impossible love. He was under investigation. Any mistake could drag him to prison and destroy Camila forever. And yet, deep in his heart, there was an unquenchable certainty. He couldn't abandon her. What would you be willing to risk to save the person you love, even if it means defying the law and putting your life on the line. Subscribe and stay until the end, because Ernesto's decision will take him down a path of no return. Ernesto spent the night awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the phone. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to call Camila, to hear her voice just once more. But he knew that would only paint a target on both their backs. Morning came with the distant noise of the city, but Ernesto remained trapped in the same question. Was it worth risking everything just to see her again? The answer came on its own. Yes. 3 days later, against all warnings from the Federals, he started his truck toward the north. He had no load, no credible excuse, only a need that consumed him. The roar of the engine was the echo of his own defiance. During the hours on the road, he imagined 1,000 scenarios. That Camila would see him arrive and smile like before, that they could talk for a few minutes, that maybe they could find a way to keep going. But reality was very different. The checkpoint appeared at midday, the scorching sun beating down on the booths. Ernesto searched among the blue uniforms, his heart pounding wildly. She wasn't there. A different officer checked his documents and, noticing his nervousness, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "No," Ernesto muttered, his voice drier than ever. "It's just that, the officer who used to check my papers, Officer Rivas." The officer looked at him with suspicion. Officer Rivas was transferred. Transferred? Ernesto repeated, feeling the ground vanish beneath his feet. "Where?" "That's none of your business. Your papers are in order. Move along." The words were a brutal blow. Ernesto drove a few meters, then stopped at a nearby gas station. He sat there motionless, his gaze lost. The only woman who had made him feel alive after years of emptiness had disappeared from his life as quickly as she had come. That night, from a lonely rest stop, he gathered the courage to dial her number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then an automated voice shattered him inside. "The number you have dialed is not in service." He sat with the phone in his hand, unable to move a muscle. It wasn't just a transfer. Camila had been erased. The following days were a descent into despair. Ernesto called police stations across Sonora, inventing excuses about paperwork or documents. No one knew anything, no one wanted to talk. It was as if Camila had never existed. Finally, exhausted and defeated, he returned to Guadalajara. But when he arrived, the Federals were already waiting for him. This time, the interrogation was much more aggressive. They wanted to know why he had returned to Sonora without authorization, why he had asked specifically about Officer Rivas, what kind of relationship he had with her. Ernesto denied everything, but he could see in their eyes that they didn't believe him. In the end, they left him with a clear ultimatum. Either he cooperated fully with the investigation, or he would face charges for obstruction of justice. "What does cooperate mean?" Ernesto asked, though deep down he feared the answer. "We want you to return to your normal routes," Ramirez explained, staring at him. "But this time working for us. If anyone approaches you with a suspicious proposal, if you notice anything unusual, you report it to us." "You're asking me to be an informant?" "We're giving you the opportunity to clear your name," Torres corrected. "And maybe help catch those responsible for all this." Ernesto felt the world closing in on him. He hadn't just lost Camila, now he was also a pawn in a dangerous game. 4 months, every trip was monitored. The Federals installed tracking devices in his truck, gave him a special phone, pressured him to report every detail. The work that had once been his refuge was now a minefield. But the worst part wasn't the surveillance. The worst part was the emptiness. Not knowing if Camila was safe, if she was even alive, if he would ever see her again. And then, on a cold January night, the special phone rang. "Miguel Dominguez," Ramirez's voice sounded graver than ever. "We have a situation. It's about Officer Rivas. We think we know what happened to her." Ernesto's heart stopped. Ramirez's call left him in shock. He didn't wait for dawn. He started his truck and drove straight to the Federal station in Guadalajara. The building, which had always felt cold and intimidating, now seemed like the prelude to an inevitable fate. Ramirez was waiting at the entrance, accompanied by Torres and a firm-looking woman with a steely gaze. "Ernesto, this is Special Agent Carmen Vega, from Internal Affairs." Just hearing that division's name made Ernesto's blood run cold. Internal Affairs meant corruption within the police itself. In a plain office, with closed blinds and folders on the table, Vega spoke with a clear, cutting voice. "What we're about to tell you is classified information. You cannot share it with anyone." Ernesto nodded silently, his hands clasped over his knees. "For months we've been investigating a network of corruption inside the National Police," Vega continued. "A network that facilitates the passage of weapons, drugs, and people through certain checkpoints." Ernesto felt a hollow in his stomach. His mind immediately went to Camila. "Is she involved?" he asked, his voice breaking. Vega looked straight at him. "No. On the contrary. Officer Rivas is the reason we were able to identify the real culprit, her own supervisor, Captain Rodriguez." Ernesto remembered the name. Camila had mentioned it once, with a mix of respect and unease. Torres spoke. "Rodriguez organized shifts to make sure certain vehicles passed without inspection." Camila began to notice patterns. She asked questions, and that put her in the crosshairs. Ramirez leaned forward, eyes heavy. The supposed transfer of Camila was never real. Rodriguez invented that story. What we believe is that they made her disappear. Ernesto's heart raced like an engine at the limit. "What do you mean by disappear?" Vega opened a folder and slid several photographs across the table. They were telephoto shots of an isolated ranch on the outskirts of Sonora. Armored vehicles, armed men, and in one of the photos, a female silhouette escorted between two men. Blurry, distant, but unmistakable in her posture. "We can't confirm it 100%, Vega said, "but we believe it could be her." Ernesto swallowed hard. His hands trembled. Then, "What do you expect from me?" Torres looked him straight in the eyes. "We want you to infiltrate." The trucker blinked, incredulous. "What?" Ramirez intervened in a grave tone. "We need someone with experience, someone who won't raise suspicion, someone who knows the route. The organization is looking for new drivers to move illegal merchandise. And you're perfect for the role." Ernesto was left breathless. "You're asking me to pose as a smuggler?" "We're asking you to help us save Officer Rivas," Vega replied coldly. "And yes, also to bring down this network." A heavy silence filled the office. Ernesto felt the world spinning too fast. His life as a lonely trucker had taken a brutal turn. Now they were asking him to risk everything in a game where every move could be his last. But something weighed more than fear. The image of Camila smiling at him that first time, the tenderness in her voice when she told him to take care, the warmth of her fingers brushing his as she handed him his documents. "I accept," he finally said, his voice firm though his heart trembled in his chest. Vega nodded without surprise, as if she had known from the start what his answer would be. "Good. We'll begin building your cover immediately." In the weeks that followed, the Federals created a false story around Ernesto. Gambling debts, financial troubles, a truck on the verge of repossession. Carefully planted rumors meant to reach Rodriguez's contacts. They also equipped him with hidden technology, a microphone in his shirt, a GPS transmitter in the sole of his boots, a tiny camera in his cap. "Remember," Vega warned him during the final training, "act desperate, but not too much. They can smell falseness from miles away. And if they mention Officer Rivas, deny any personal link. If you admit anything, it'll get her killed." The first test came one morning in Mazatlan. While Ernesto was having breakfast in a roadside restaurant, a thin man with nervous eyes sat down opposite him without invitation. "Miguel Dominguez, right?" he said in a low voice. "Who's asking?" "My name is Carlos. I understand you might be interested in a special job." Ernesto stayed calm, though cold sweat ran down his back. "Depends on the job." Carlos smiled coldly. "A simple delivery. Guadalajara to Hermosillo. Excellent pay. No questions." Ernesto's heart raced. He knew this was the beginning of a dangerous game. I'm interested, he replied. Carlos nodded. Perfect. Tomorrow at 10 p.m., abandoned warehouse at kilometer 45, on the Chapala Road. Don't arrive early, don't arrive late. And with that, he disappeared into the crowd. Ernesto sat alone, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. He knew he was entering territory of no return. But he also knew that maybe this was the only way to see Camila again. What would you do if the only hope of saving the love of your life was risking working with the same criminals who hold her captive? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Ernesto is about to face will put not only his freedom at stake, but his life. The next night, Ernesto drove toward kilometer 45, on the Chapala Road. The trailer thudded through the darkness like a metallic monster, but he felt every turn of the wheel leading him straight into the wolf's mouth. The abandoned warehouse stood in the middle of nowhere, a building with cracked walls, broken windows, and a silence that weighed like lead. Yet it was not empty. 2 more trucks were parked and several off-road vehicles guarded by armed men. At 10 on the dot, as instructed, additional trucks arrived. Men in balaclavas descended and began loading boxes into the trailers. The process was fast, meticulous, almost military. No one spoke more than necessary. A tall man with a trimmed beard and a predator's gaze approached Ernesto. "You're going to Hermosillo," he said, handing him a paper with an address. "Arrive, unload, and disappear." Ernesto nodded, tucking the paper away with hands barely steady. "What's in the boxes?" he asked, trying to sound curious but not too much. The man looked at him with disdain. "Nothing you need to know about. Drive and shut up." The trip to Hermosillo was the longest of his life. Each kilometer was a mix of fear and hope. The Federals followed him at a distance, monitoring everything from headquarters, but Ernesto knew that if anything went wrong, there would be no time for rescues. Arriving at the given address, he found an almost deserted industrial district. The destination warehouse was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. As he approached, the gates opened automatically, as if they had been watching him from afar. Several men waited inside. One of them, clearly the boss, introduced himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Welcome, Ernesto. My name is Joaquin." He led him to an improvised office while others unloaded the boxes. The place smelled of sweat, tobacco, and dirty money. "Carlos says you're looking for steady work," Joaquin said, studying him coldly. "That's right," Ernesto answered, following the script the Federals had given him. "Times are tough. The bank almost repossessed my truck." Joaquin lit a cigarette and blew out the smoke slowly. "I understand. Well, I have good news. If this delivery goes well, there will be more. But I need to make sure you understand what it implies." Ernesto swallowed. "What does it imply?" "Sometimes we move merchandise, and sometimes we move people," Joaquin said without taking his eyes off him. "People who prefer to travel without papers. Or people who have asked too many questions." Ernesto's heart lurched. Everything in him told him they were talking about Camila. "I understand," he murmured, trying to stay calm. Joaquin smiled coldly. "Perfect, because we happen to have such a case. A former police officer who's been annoying us for months with her curiosity. We've had her here for a while, but it's time to move her to a more permanent place." The world stopped for Ernesto. His breathing grew heavy, his hands sweated under the table. But he could not show anything. "And what do you want me to do?" he asked in a neutral voice. "We want you to transport her," Joaquin replied, extinguishing the cigarette with a slow gesture. "Today." Ernesto felt a brutal vertigo, as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. There it was. The opportunity, and the risk, he had been waiting for. What would you do if the life of the person you love depended on continuing to play the role of a criminal, without anyone discovering you're actually an infiltrator? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Ernesto is about to face is a danger where a single mistake could cost both of them their lives. The air inside the warehouse was dense, heavy with tobacco smoke and the metallic smell of weapons. Ernesto tried to stay calm, but inside he felt each heartbeat would betray him. Joaquin looked at him coldly. The officer is in one of the back rooms. He snapped his fingers, and two armed men nodded. Bring her. Ernesto forced himself to keep his face impassive, as if this were just another job. But inside, every second stabbed into his chest like a dagger. The metal doors opened, and two guards dragged out a handcuffed woman, her hair disheveled, her clothes dirty. Even before seeing her face, Ernesto knew. It was Camila. When she lifted her head, her eyes found his instantly. They were tired, dulled by captivity, but the moment they recognized him, a spark of disbelief and hope lit within them. Ernesto restrained the impulse to run to her. If he did, it would all end right then and there. He had to be strong. He had to keep playing the part. Joaquin watched the scene with interest. "Do you know her?" he asked with a poisonous smile. Ernesto took a deep breath and lowered his gaze, as if the question didn't matter. "First time I've seen her." His voice came out firm, even surprising himself. Camila looked at him with pleading, confused eyes, but Ernesto shot her a quick, almost imperceptible glance, a silent message. "Trust me." "Good," Joaquin said, rising from his chair. "Then there won't be a problem. This woman must disappear from the map. You'll transport her tonight." Ernesto nodded, feigning indifference. "Understood." The men pushed her past him, and as they did, Ernesto caught the faint perfume that still lingered on her skin despite captivity. She was real. She was alive. "You'll leave in an hour," Joaquin ordered. "We have a place to stash her, far from prying eyes. I don't want failures, Dominguez. If you prove we can trust you, you'll have steady work." Ernesto clenched his fists to keep them from trembling. "There won't be failures." While the guards locked Camila back in a closed room, Ernesto stepped outside under the pretext of checking his truck. He started the engine just to cover the noise of his ragged breathing. In his pocket, the transmitter vibrated discreetly, a signal that the Federals had heard everything. But it was one thing for them to know where Camila was. It was another to get her out alive. Ernesto stared at himself in the rear-view mirror. His eyes were red, tense, like those of a man at the edge of the abyss. That night, he would not just be transporting a prisoner. He would be transporting the woman who had brought him back to life. And he knew a single mistake could doom them both. What would you do if the life of the person you love depended on your ability to pretend you were the executioner leading her to her doom? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what's coming will be the most dangerous and heartbreaking moment for Ernesto and Camila. The hour came too soon. Joaquin's men opened the room and brought Camila out with her hands cuffed and a blindfold over her eyes. Her steps were unsteady, but the dignity in her posture remained intact. "Here's your cargo, Dominguez," one of the guards said with a cruel smile. Ernesto nodded coldly, feigning indifference. "Put her in the cab." Camila was shoved into the passenger seat. Ernesto started the engine, and the roar of the trailer mixed with the metallic echo of the warehouse doors closing behind him. As they rolled along the dark highway, the silence became unbearable. Ernesto glanced sideways, seeing how Camila kept her head high despite everything. Finally, when they were far enough away, he spoke in a low voice. "It's me." Camila turned her face toward him, incredulous, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Ernesto." "Yes." He kept his eyes on the road, pretending to focus, but every word came from deep within. "I'm undercover. The Federals recruited me. They're following us." She let out a stifled sob. "I thought I'd never see you again." He reached out and brushed her cuffed fingers lightly. "Don't say anything else. We have to pretend I'm part of this. If they find out, we're dead." Camila nodded, swallowing her tears. The truck rolled on under a moonless sky. With every kilometer, Ernesto felt the air grow heavier. The Federals had promised backup, but there was no sign of them. He was alone, driving toward an unknown destination with the woman he loved as forbidden cargo in the seat beside him. Suddenly, a metallic screech tore through the night. Lights flared in the rearview mirror. Two black SUVs were tailing them closely. Ernesto understood instantly. They didn't trust him. They were escorting him. "Damn it!" Ernesto muttered under his breath. Camila tensed. What's happening? They're following us. They want to make sure I don't try anything. The road was narrow, surrounded by dark brushland. Ernesto knew that any wrong move would mean the end. He had to play his cards right until the last moment. He gripped the wheel tightly and, in a barely audible whisper, told Camila, "When I say now, duck down. Whatever happens, don't look back." She looked at him, her eyes full of fear, but nodded without hesitation. The plan was risky, almost suicidal. But Ernesto knew the only way to save her was to act before reaching the destination. The trailer roared, accelerating violently. The SUVs behind responded instantly, switching on their high beams that blinded them through the mirrors. Ernesto took a deep breath. Everything would come down to a single instant. What would you do if your only chance to save the love of your life was to risk your own existence in a desperate maneuver in the middle of the darkness? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what's about to happen on this road will forever change the fate of Ernesto and Camila. The roar of the trailer echoed like a war drum on the deserted highway. Ernesto gripped the wheel with both hands, sweat dripping down his forehead. The two black SUVs followed close behind, like wolves circling their prey. "Ernesto," Camila whispered, her voice breaking. "What are you going to do?" He glanced at her briefly, then fixed his gaze ahead. "Get us out of here alive." The high beams from the vehicles behind blinded him through the mirrors. Ernesto knew he couldn't take them to the marked destination. If they arrived, she would be delivered to a place she'd never leave. He had to act there, in the middle of nowhere. He slammed the accelerator. The trailer roared and picked up speed, tires screeching against the hot night asphalt. The SUVs also sped up, drawing dangerously close. Suddenly, Ernesto cut the headlights and swerved sharply onto a barely visible dirt road. The trailer bounced violently, throwing up dust and rocks. The SUVs took a second to react, enough for one to skid and nearly flip into a ditch. "Duck now," Ernesto shouted. Camila obeyed, dropping against the dashboard just as the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. Bullets slammed into the trailer's body, ricocheting like steel hammers. Ernesto maneuvered skillfully, zigzagging along the narrow dirt road. The truck shook, threatening to roll, but he held control with a mix of instinct and raw desperation. In the mirror, one SUV was already out of the fight, its engine smoking after slamming into a post. The other kept coming, closer and closer. Ernesto took a deep breath, searching for an opening. He found it, an old concrete bridge, narrow and crumbling, stretched a few meters ahead. "Hold on, Camila," he murmured. With a sudden move, Ernesto slowed, letting the enemy SUV close the distance. When it was almost on the trailer's bumper, he slammed the brakes with all his strength. The trailer screeched like a wounded beast. The SUV had no time to react. It smashed into the platform with a brutal crash, sparks flying, its engine destroyed. Silence fell suddenly, broken only by Ernesto's panting and the truck's engine still rumbling under his hands. Camila lifted her head, tears in her eyes. You did it?" "Not yet," Ernesto said hoarsely. "This was just the beginning." He pressed the accelerator and returned to the road, speeding away from the scene. He knew Joaquin and his people would soon realize something had gone wrong. And when they did, they would come after him with everything they had. As he drove through the darkness, Ernesto grabbed Camila's cuffed hand and squeezed it tightly. "I promise I'll get you out of this, even if it's the last thing I do." She looked at him, tears shining in her tired eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled faintly. "I know." But Ernesto also knew something else. In this game, promises could cost lives. What would you do if, after a momentary victory, you knew the real storm was just beginning, and now the criminal network was hunting you and the person you love? Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Ernesto and Camila will face after this night will be more dangerous than any desert highway. The dawn painted the distant mountains orange as Ernesto's trailer, battered by bullets and dust, staggered along a dirt road. Camila, still handcuffed, looked at him with tired eyes but filled with a faith that burned him inside. "Ernesto, if we don't make it out, I want you to know that I never," her voice trembled, "never regretted meeting you." He gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Don't say that. We're going to make it." Though deep down, he knew that promise could shatter at any second. The hidden communicator in his boot vibrated. It was Vega. "Dominguez, we have your signal. Stay calm. We're preparing the operation on the ranch. Repeat, do not act alone." But it was too late. Joaquin had already given the order to hunt him down. In the distance, Ernesto saw in the rearview mirror 3 SUVs kicking up clouds of dust, closing in fast. The roar of the engines mixed with the whistle of bullets piercing the trailer's body. Ernesto knew that if he stopped, it would all end there. He slammed the accelerator and turned onto a narrow path leading to the ranch. It was madness, but the only way to get close enough for the Federals to intervene. "Hold on!" he shouted. The trailer rammed through the barbed wire fence, tearing it apart like paper. Inside, armed men ran, startled by the truck's sudden intrusion. Ernesto hit the brakes hard, the trailer skidding and slamming into a rusted tank. The crash shook the world. The windshield shattered into 1,000 pieces. Dazed, Ernesto barely had time to cut Camila's handcuffs with a hidden knife. "Run!" he yelled. Camila staggered out of the cab, but men were already surrounding them. Gunfire echoed everywhere. Dust from the crash turned everything into an unbreathable cloud. Amid the chaos, Rodriguez appeared, immaculate in his uniform, pistol in hand, a twisted smile of someone who believed victory was assured. "I knew you were the weak link, Dominguez." His voice rose above the gunfire. "And she was always a nuisance." Ernesto stepped in front of Camila, eyes blazing. "If you want to kill her, you'll have to go through me." Rodriguez raised his pistol. Time seemed to stop. And then, hell broke loose. The Federals' SUVs stormed in with sirens blaring, red and blue lights slicing through the dawn. Hooded agents descended, firing controlled bursts. The ranch became a battlefield. Ernesto dragged Camila into a ditch, shielding her with his body as bullets flew overhead. He could hear the thunder of explosions, the screams of men falling, the whistle of shrapnel slicing the air. When he finally raised his head, he saw Rodriguez fleeing toward an armored truck. "No!" Ernesto roared, climbing out of the ditch. He ran after him, staggering, his body battered. Gunfire zipped past inches from his skin, but he didn't stop. He reached the truck just as it started and, with a desperate leap, clung to the door. Rodriguez turned, surprised, and struck him with the butt of his pistol. Ernesto fought back, grappling in a brutal struggle. The two men rolled on the ground as the truck crashed into a wall. In the chaos of the fight, Ernesto managed to disarm him and point the weapon at his chest. He had the chance to end it all. Rodriguez, bleeding from his forehead, smirked mockingly. "If you kill me, you'll never know where the rest of the network is. And she'll never be safe." Ernesto's finger trembled on the trigger. He could end the man who had destroyed their lives. But he also knew Rodriguez might be telling the truth. The network was bigger than just one man. A gunshot rang out. Ernesto froze. He looked at his own hand. He hadn't fired. Rodriguez fell to the ground, eyes wide open, dead. Behind him, Camila held a gun in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wasn't going to let him kill you," she whispered. Ernesto hugged her tightly, without a word. The dawn lit up the ranch reduced to ruins, Federals securing the site, bodies scattered on the ground. But Rodriguez had died without revealing anything more. And though Camila was alive, the network remained active, hidden in the shadows. That night, in a cheap motel on the outskirts, Ernesto and Camila looked at each other in silence. He took her hands and said the only thing he could. "This isn't over." She nodded, her eyes red but filled with determination. "I know. And even if we have to hide, even if we have to live on the run, I'd rather that than lose you." Ernesto looked out the window, at the road stretching endlessly under the moon. The highway was still there, waiting for him, as always. But now it wasn't a refuge. It was an open war against an invisible enemy. He lit a cigarette, crushed it out immediately, and took Camila's hand again. The road isn't letting us go yet. And with that, it was clear their story was far from over. They survived, but the network still lives. Love keeps them together, though their destiny now is to wander highways stained with danger.